Good morning, Ingrid, and thank you very much for giving some of your time to talk to the Mint magazine.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Well, what I'd like to talk to you about today is the interaction between the history of economic thought and colonization, and what then decolonization of economic thought means. But to start with, if we go back to the classical period and the early days of economic thinking, when clearly colonies were a thing, how did that sort of shape economic thinking?
Great. Thank you for that question. So this is something that I've been working on this topic with a few co-authors, Serbi Kezar, Devika Dutt, Carolina Alves, for a while. And we trace the foundations of the economics discipline basically to the classical period that you're asking about, which was also the development of capitalism. And there were a lot of things happening at that time, of course. And what we argue is that the way that the field was born it's shaped by the colonial history and transatlantic slave trade and the development of capitalism in the way that the ideas that came about were very Eurocentric. And what do we mean by that? Eurocentric is, and then Smith, Ricardo have like Eurocentric features that we identify. And so Eurocentrism, the way that Samir Amin, for example, talks about it, is this idea that capitalism developed as something that was internal to Europe or internal to England. So it was something that had to do with, improvements in technology, hard work, good culture, things like that, that led England to have this, amazing industrial revolution that was rational, progressive, and that this kind of system of capitalism could spread to across the world, right? And that's Eurocentric, we argue, because it doesn't take into account the colonial kind of support for the development of capitalism, the role of the transatlantic slave trade, racialization, even exploitation, how capitalism actually developed as a very brutal and violent system. So therefore, given that they don't see it as a global system that actually relied on capitalism as a global force, the idea that it could then develop in the same way, for example, in Brazil or Ghana or something, is completely, utopian or doesn't make any sense, because of course Ghana and Brazil played a role also in the way that capitalism evolved globally, as where England was the center. Because Smith, Ricardo, and other classical political economists were thinking like this, some of the concepts that they came up with have to do with kind of rational, the economy evolving as something rational. And you see growth as something that can happen as a national project rather than seeing how it's interlinked with the global aspects. They would see often have methodological individualist idea of how people are people function in the economy, but also how nations function in the economy, not seeing them as connected and impacting each other, but rather seeing them as isolated individuals or units of analysis. And this then, of course, I mean, the classical economists still had this idea of class, and that the process of economic growth was turbulent. But when the marginalists came along in the late 1800s,
Can I just stop you there, because
yeah.
I'm sort of interested in trying to explain how they could have been so blind, if you like. I mean, they lived in a world where the empire, the British Empire, obviously was a key facet. Colonialization, colonies were an important part of the world, etc. I mean, it's not as if they didn't know they existed. Yeah. They must have known, obviously, the slave trade and the fight over the abolition and so forth. That was huge in that period. So how do you think they could have been so blind to ignore that part of reality in the development of classical economics?
Yeah, it's a great question. And not that easy to kind of speculate exactly on their sort of individual ideas, but I think what we see with the development of capitalism as this unequal system is that there was also this development of what's it, the idea is escaping me, an ideology, sorry. So first you had this unequal system evolving, and then you have this ideology that emerged to justify the inequality, where you see in a lot of the writing at that time, colonialism is justified as something that is about civilizing the colonial subject, that empire is something that's good because it's good for Britain, but it's also good for the world because it's about, a progressive development of capitalism. And of course, like with the slave trade, and the scholars in the Black radical tradition wrote about this, later on in the early 1900s, that the slave trade also basically created racialization and a black and white dichotomy to justify this trade in human beings, right? So I think that there was a prevailing racist ideology at the time that helped to justify the inequalities that everyone saw. And of course, Smith and Ricardo were a part of this, kind of a part of this ideology as well. So that's one thing that's like, oh, there's a discourse that emerged that was basically, in the UK about trying to legitimize inequalities. But then, of course, there's also kind of their personal positionality that we could also speculate about. And we know that Ricardo, for example, was a landowner, and he had probably particular motivations for, promoting free trade, for example. He wanted, tariffs to be removed from agricultural goods, which was also good for him as him personally. So I think it's probably a mix of ideology and also their sort of personal positionalities, because it's not like at that time there were also people that were critical of empire, right? But that was not, these people were not critical. But Marx, for example, was much more critical of the system and had a much more anti-systemic idea.
But Marx didn't really include colonies in his models either, did he?
No, he didn't, but I think the way he theorized, well, some of his later work did, but like his most kind of famous, Capital Volume 1, Grundrisse, doesn't explicitly, but it is a global kind of, at least you can see like in his outline, he wanted to write about the global history as well, although he didn't get to it. And his theory, although it doesn't say exactly like what the role the colonies played, or like the slave trade or anything like that, it doesn't assume a kind of rational and endogenous process like the Eurocentric view of the classical political economists. So in that sense, it's true he didn't like specifically include the colonies, but he also didn't provide any kind of theory that was assuming that capitalism was something that could spread, evenly across the world or anything like that. So he didn't contribute. I would argue he didn't contribute to this Eurocentric aspect, although I know that there are some Marxists later that have interpreted Marx in a Eurocentric way.
I mean, it's sort of interesting, I suppose, as well, that during that period, lots of wars, and colonization was a process of taking things with violence, etc. But of course, violence also does not appear in classical economics, does it? I mean, I wonder, is that because somehow there's compartmentalization, if you like, that violence, making war with something else, and then economies are sort of the bit in the piece?
Exactly. I think that's exactly it, which kind of lays the foundation for what comes later. But definitely that they see the economy as something that is subject to specific laws that don't have to do with the political side, which is, could be violent or, but other things.
So you grab the resources.
Yeah.
Once you've got the resources, now we're doing economics, sort of thing. It is amazing. So, okay, so moving on from the classical to the marginalist revolution or whatever, I mean, how does that then affect the colonization of economics?
Yeah, so this was basically, during the time of the classicals, there was still debate, at least, Marx is debating with Ricardo, and there's like there's classes, there's dynamics, there's inequality. Then the marginalists come, and that's basically when the economics discipline begins to become formed, and they basically laid the foundation for economics as a discipline. And this is where we argue that the Eurocentric elements of classical political economy become cemented and firmed up, and basically the Eurocentric elements become the foundations, because you have Marshall, Walras, Menger, Robbins coming in and saying, okay, we need let's labor theory of value, things like that, and rather think about a subjective theory of value, where like the real kind of foundation is choice, like individual choice. This becomes important, and Robbins has this, famous description of economics that, actually a lot of economists today also refer to. I think the American Economic Association has it on their website, where it talks about economics being about choice in the face of scarcity. So, economics then becomes about the individual. So methodological individualism basically is cemented. You have the rational actor, you study how they behave in markets. So it becomes about markets and it becomes about the individual. So basically all analysis of class is then left behind. And all analysis of like the social relations of production also become left behind. And again, and you kind of stay at the surface level of markets. So then the Eurocentric aspects then become a bit less visible, but we argue that they're very clearly there in the assumption that capitalism is something that, evolved in a rational way. It's about individual actors making rational choices and kind of the markets operating in a, more efficient way. And that's something that is assumed that that's what is needed for capitalism to evolve in a progressive way, even though, of course, the marginalists and those that came after talked less and less actually about capitalism as a system and rather just talked about markets, the economy. But underlying is this assumption about rationality. It assumes away a kind of unequal structure between people, between nations, and just becomes like much more like technical. Or it presents itself as technical, but of course this has is still based on this Eurocentric foundation that then serves to legitimize policies that have to do with just supporting markets, which I would argue also legitimizes any kind of or it legitimizes policies that don't deal with uneven development, inequality, unequal trade relationships and things like that. That's just kind of swept away as something that doesn't have to do with economics anymore. So therefore, this Eurocentric foundations become much stronger at the same time as they become more invisible. So, and this, I know we're not going to talk about like, economics today. But I think the fact that, the foundations become invisible and the politics is kind of removed makes it also much harder to have debate about these issues in economics.
And so was there any pushback? Because yes, this whole process seems to be a process of making things and people invisible, isn't it? Or sort of almost denying a whole set of reality. Were the people at that time who pointed this out or challenged it, or is this just more recent?
There was definitely debate, and it wasn't a given that this would become, the foundation for economics for the next century. So there was debate, and I think it only really, and of course, later on you get to Keynes, and there's the marginalist Keynesian debate. So I don't think that it wasn't obvious that they were going to become like the founding fathers of economics at the time. But really their dominance got cemented later with the Cold War, when all other kind of alternatives got removed from the debates, or from the kind of mainstream of the debates. You had actually, like, for example, Daniela Guizzo, who I think you know as well. She's done some interesting work on like the origins of heterodox economics. And she finds that, the term heterodox also emerges around that time because people disagree with the ideas that the classical political economists, but also then the marginalists. So there is this opposition, there's French economists, British economists that kind of disagree, but then position themselves as like in opposition to the marginalists. So there's definitely debate. It wasn't a given that they would win the battle of ideas as such, but they were also, writing in, like, Robbins was at LSE, so they were in, positions of institutional power. But yeah, it wasn't like they were the only ones, no.
And what about economists rising up in the colonies themselves, or is that later? I mean, were there any thinkers emerging? Because that was the sort of time of the beginning of the sort of independence movement, and presuming the growth of the intellectual backing to that independence movement.
That's a really good question. And, you know, in the history of thought books, you probably won't find many references to that until probably, yeah, post-war period. But there were economists that were pushing back for sure. And like Chrissy Thornton and Eric Highliner have some very good articles and books on this, where they actually trace the development, the origins of development to like before League of Nations, during League of Nations, before like the Truman period, which is when, you know, most people trace like the development era back to Truman, which was 1944 of his speech. But actually there was a lot of debate, like Chinese scholars, Indian scholars, Latin American scholars and politicians arguing that there needed to be a transfer of technology to countries in the global south, transfer of resources, that kind of like implicitly challenging the Eurocentrism of economics in the core or in the center, but not using that terminology, but rather just saying, look, you know, the technology evolved in the global south, in the global north. There needs to be a redistribution in order for us to also have our industrial revolution. So there is quite a lot of scholarship on that that actually I think needs to be researched more and like brought to light more, because it's really neglected. But there's Tandika Makandawiri has a paper where he compares the Bandung scholarship, or the Bandung narrative, and the Truman narrative, where the Bandung narrative includes a lot of the scholars from the global south. Of course, Bandung was 1955, so that's later. But there's like the work of Chrissy Thornton and Eric Highliner shows that actually the stuff that came up in Bandung about like the need for sovereignty, the need for technological transfers and things like that, actually had much deeper roots from like early 1900s in the global south.
And so this sort of fundamental lack of a colonial or power-based dimension to economic thinking pre-Second World War, I mean, how do you think that's affected the state of things now in economics?
So I think the debates I just mentioned about the scholars in the global south kind of demanding transfers and technology and things like that, that did push Truman, you know, the president of the US, and who gave the speech in his inaugural speech in 1944. He put forward this idea that, you know, the US was going to support development, and they would do so by, you know, opening up markets, investments, foreign direct investment, this kind of thing, like basically the foundation of like what later became modernization theory, of like the idea of just, you know, opening up to trade, allowing US to come in and invest, and then, you know, all countries will go through the same stages. The countries are just latecomers. The developing countries are just latecomers. They will go through the same stages as the global north, in order to become, you know, highly industrialized developed countries. Of course, this again is like this very internalist idea of development that doesn't take into account imperialism or anything like that. And this foundation is still very much there today. So you see it even in the scholars who claim to be like taking colonialism seriously, like, you know, the new institutional economists that recently won the Nobel Prize in economics, Achamulu, Robinson, and Johnson. Even, you know, they talk about colonialism as something that had to do, like, that did impact the development of capitalism, but they see it as an external shock that created a specific set of institutions, like private property rights or extractive institutions. And that had an impact on the long-term development of these countries. So again, they don't see it as something that is like a global system that has like dynamics within it that creates uneven development, but rather they just focus on like institutions, private property rights as something that is like, creates good development, and then extractive institutions, that's something that creates bad outcomes. So actually they're sweeping under the carpet, you know, unequal trade relationships, uneven development, imperialism, colonialism, as a dynamic system. That's
and they're trying, I suppose, to say that colonization happened in the past.
Yes, exactly.
Just knock things in a particular direction, but it's all gone now, and it's just we're all in a global economy trying to trade and create the right institutions. So yeah,
Exactly. And then it becomes, yeah, exactly. So now, okay, there's bad legacy, but then you just need to improve your institutions domestically to improve. And then there's also the, the randomistas in development economics, that are promoting randomized control trials. In Duflo and Banerjee's book, Poor Economics, that came a decade ago now, they say, there's these debates between the new institutional economists and other political economists that have these debates about like the big like developments in history, colonialism and these things. And then they say, they're very difficult to say anything about because we don't have counterfactuals. We don't know what would have happened without colonialism. So let's just focus on the small things. And then they go to individual behavior. So then you're back with like basically the roots of the marginalists that we talked about earlier. That it's all about like nudging people to like behave more rationally, or creating institutions which nudge people or like incentivize people to do the right thing, get their kids vaccinated, and basically just removing themselves from the big debate. So you have those two things, the kind of Acemoglu and Johnson and Robinson kind of view that's about institutions, and then you have the randomistas that's about no, just nudge individuals, and that's the most efficient way you can reduce poverty.
And I suppose that the connecting thread seems to be through all of this one of sweeping these things under the carpet in slightly different ways.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Do you think that's a reasonable summary, isn't it? We just don't want to know about it. We don't want to engage with it, because to engage with it would be, I suppose, to see ourselves as maybe bad people in some way, as people who've relied on exploitation for where we are today and on an ongoing basis.
Exactly. It's sweeping under the carpet. But then also, because if they were to bring it out, I think that, given that they have this, we haven't mentioned neoclassical yet, but the marginalists, of course, kind of came to form the school of thought called neoclassical. So if, they were to take away the carpet and take out all these things you mentioned, exploitation and whatever, it's not really possible to incorporate that into their theoretical framework, right? Because it's fundamentally methodological individualist. So, and the stuff under this carpet is like structural issues of exploitation, like you mentioned, and imperialism. So actually, it becomes impossible. They would need to discard their framework and look to other theories.
But they've always sort of created their framework so that it can't take that. So it's just sort of leaves it in the background. Right. Well, that is absolutely fascinating, and it's really, when you go through that sort of history, it is quite shocking, isn't it, really?
Yeah, I agree. I hope, so we have a book coming out in May. So hopefully, let's see if any of the mainstream economists read it, but hopefully, some people will also find this very shocking.
Well, I'd like to talk to you about that book as well once it's out, and brilliant, maybe for our next issue, and also see what sort of response you get.
Yeah. No, that'd be great. So far, when we've tried to present it to mainstream audiences, it's almost sometimes felt like we're talking past each other. But let's see if we can figure out a better way to communicate.
Well, let's hope so. Thank you very much, Ingrid. That's been absolutely fascinating.
Thank you.